Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, The Race Beyond Diesel, the Cost Realities of Zero-Emission Trucking. My name is Chris Robinson, Senior Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Anu Bupalam, Analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. But if your question doesn't get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll make sure to respond. And lastly, if at any point you have technical difficulties like a frozen screen, first try refreshing your browser and check that you have a strong internet connection. Now let's jump into the presentation. Over to you, Anurd.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Chris. Welcome from my side as well to this webinar. Today we'll be discussing the economics of zero emissions trucking and sharing some results on our analysis comparing various zero emissions truck drivers. So let's begin by looking at why freight transport has become such a focus for decarbonization. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, electric trucks account for roughly 5% of global CO2 emissions. This is in spite of them making up only roughly 9% of the global vehicle fleet. To add some perspective to that, trucking causes more emissions than shipping and aviation combined. What adds to this is that freight demand continues to grow. Some projections say that trucking activity could double by 2050, and without any changes, that could end up accounting for roughly 75% of road freight emissions by that time. Therefore, emissions need to fall while freight volumes need to rise. The industry simply cannot reduce activity, and efficiency improvements alone are not going to offset long-term growth. Therefore, there's more interest in reducing or eliminating emissions. We're also seeing policy interest increase across most of the world. So for instance, in Europe, there's regulatory pressure and economic incentives. The EU has introduced CO2 standards for heavy-duty vehicles, requiring them to progressively reduce emissions over time. They've also introduced the Eurovignette framework, which allows countries to vary tolls based on emissions. They also have infrastructure programs such as the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Regulation, which requires installation of charging or refueling infrastructure along specified corridors. China has been leading for over 15 years with more of a holistic policy approach. So national and provincial governments have supported vehicle purchases, encouraged fleet replacement, and invested in a lot of charging infrastructure. Therefore, China has become the largest market for electric trucks globally. The US is a bit more fragmented, with much of the activity driven by California. For example, the state recently announced $1 billion in tax rebates for medium and heavy-duty trucks. Federal support has also helped accelerate deployment, although policy direction has become a little less certain recently. Despite that, fleet operators continue to evaluate electrification for operating costs. At the same time, fleet operators are also dealing with increased fuel price volatility. So diesel is one of the largest operating expenses in trucking, often accounting for more than 20% of operating costs. So when diesel prices move quickly, fleet economics can change significantly. The chart here shows what's happening with diesel prices, especially in light of the recent US-Iran conflict. Fuel prices have increased sharply, and this creates uncertainty for fleet operators that simply cannot really pass these costs to customers. So fleet operators care about certainty in terms of fuel prices. They do not want exposure to fuel price volatility because predictable operating costs make it easier to plan routes, negotiate contracts, and manage margins. So this is why electrification is gaining a lot of interest. So when people talk about zero emissions trucking, typically the conversation is around battery electric versus hydrogen. But in reality, there's a broader set of pathways. The most mature one is conventional battery electric trucking using plug-in charging. This is where most commercial deployment is occurring today. So this could be depot charging or public charging, for instance. The next set is wireless charging and catenary systems. So these aim to provide energy to the truck while it is operating, reducing the need for large onboard batteries. They also reduce any downtime due to charging stops, but they do come with significant infrastructure requirements. Next, there's battery swapping, where a depleted battery is simply swapped out for a fully charged one. This also reduces charging downtime, but is dependent on a network of swapping station and standardization. And finally, there's hydrogen fuel cell trucking. This takes a fundamentally different approach by generating electricity on board using hydrogen and fuel cells, rather than storing all of the energy in a battery. So the key question emerging is then, how do these compare economically? So this brings us to the central question of this webinar. Which zero emissions trucking pathway will achieve cost parity with diesel first? So first, I'll briefly explain the total cost of ownership model that we used and the assumptions behind our analysis. Then we'll look at tipping point results and identify conditions under which different technologies become competitive with diesel. And finally, we'll go into an outlook and what this means. So first, let me explain the scope of the analysis. We evaluated 5 emerging zero emissions trucking pathways, so essentially just the ones I described. I will note here that we assume that all required infrastructure exists in the cost analysis. So we do not consider any costs of installing infrastructure. And for battery swapping, we assume that it runs in a battery as a service business model where the battery element is decoupled from the CapEx and moves to the OpEx. We look at 3 major regions, the US, Europe, and Asia, since trucking economics are highly regional. Diesel prices, electricity prices, labor costs, utilization patterns, regulations, etc., can all vary from one market to another. So to compare these technologies, we built a total cost of ownership, or TCO, model that incorporates 4 major variables. The first is the truck itself, so elements like vehicle cost, maintenance cost, range, charging, or refueling time. The second is energy prices. This is one of the most important inputs because of the economics of diesel, battery electric, and hydrogen trucks are heavily influenced by fuel and electricity costs. Next, we account for driving time regulations. So drivers can't operate continuously. So regulations around rest periods can determine how much of a disadvantage charging time actually creates. And finally, we look at vehicle utilization. A truck that travels more miles per year accumulates fuel savings much faster, which can significantly improve the economics of these trucks. So using these variables, we can calculate cost per mile of each technology for any given project duration. And using that, we can compute tipping points. So the key metric we use throughout this presentation is the tipping point. So diesel trucks typically start with a lower upfront cost, but they continue to incur higher fuel costs throughout their lifetime. Excuse me. Many zero emissions trucks have the opposite profile. They start with a higher upfront cost, but they can benefit from lower operating costs. So we can calculate and plot these cost per kilometer curves. And the point where these 2 curves intersect is what we call the tipping point. So that is the moment where the zero emissions truck becomes less expensive to operate than the diesel truck on a cumulative basis. So as we go through the results, a lower tipping point means the technology becomes economically competitive more quickly. With that in place, let's now look at some results. I'd first like to start off with some overarching high-level conclusions. So the first and maybe most unsurprising finding from the analysis is that battery electric trucks generally achieve cost parity with diesel earlier than hydrogen fuel trucks. And we will dig into that a little more. So 3 factors consistently emerged as the most important drivers. First, electricity prices have a major impact on battery electric truck economics. Second, hydrogen fuel costs remain a significant barrier for fuel cell trucks. And third, higher vehicle utilization accelerates parity because fuel savings accumulate more quickly. Let's dig into each of these. So first, electricity prices. I'll first explain some of our scenarios around electricity pricing. So rather than assuming a single electricity price, we modeled a range of prices representing different charging environments. So the low price scenario represents depot charging, where fleets are able to access commercial electricity rates and charge vehicles at their own facilities. The medium price scenario reflects public charging, where electricity costs are typically much higher. And the high price scenario represents periods of elevated energy prices, such as those that might occur during major market disruptions or global geopolitical events. Similarly, we vary diesel prices. So recent events have highlighted how volatile diesel prices can be. So we consider both a lower pre-conflict diesel price environment and a higher post-conflict type diesel price environment. So let's start with the low electricity price scenario, which is most representative of depot charging. The figure shows tipping point ranges of the battery electric trucking pathways across the US, Europe, and Asia. Each marker represents a different technology, and the line shows us the range of tipping points that results from varying diesel prices. So the length of the line tells us how sensitive a technology's competitiveness is to changes in diesel prices. So I'd like to highlight some key takeaways from this figure. So first, battery swapping reaches parity the fastest across most scenarios. It combines the operating costs benefits of electrification with minimal downtime. Rather than waiting to recharge, trucks can quickly swap batteries and return to service, which improves asset utilization. Higher diesel prices consistently accelerate parity. As diesel prices rise, the fuel cost savings from electrification become larger. We see this especially in Europe, where diesel prices are really high and tipping points are much lower. And as expected, we see the opposite in the US, where diesel prices are much lower. And in the US, we also see the biggest drops. So with high diesel prices, the tipping point for plug-in charging drops by almost 9 years, which is quite significant. Finally, low-cost electricity, which is the scenario, creates a favorable environment for battery electric trucking. This is particularly important because depot charging is the most mature charging model today. It's not really dependent on public charging, so it is the strongest near-term pathway. Let's now move from the low-cost depot charging scenario to the medium electricity price or public charging scenario. So many battery electric trucking pathways that reached parity relatively quickly in the previous scenario no longer achieve parity within the vehicle lifetime. So in several cases, the tipping point exceeds beyond 20 years, which is where the graph looks fairly empty. And this is effectively outside the economic life of the truck. Only catenary and wireless charging systems remain competitive across a broader range of scenarios. And these, as I mentioned earlier, help reduce the amount of onboard battery capacity required and improve vehicle utilization. And that helps offset some of the higher electricity costs. And next, diesel prices, or higher diesel prices, I should say, continue to help electrification economics, particularly in Europe and Asia. However, the impact is no longer large enough to compensate for the increase in charging costs. So the key takeaway here is that electricity prices matter enormously. We've looked at battery electric trucking. Let's now turn to hydrogen fuel cell trucks. As with electricity, we modeled 3 hydrogen price scenarios. So the low-cost scenario represents on-site hydrogen production, excluding any infrastructure costs. The medium cost scenario represents hydrogen purchased from a fueling station, and the high cost scenario reflects periods of elevated energy prices or market disruptions. The first takeaway here is that hydrogen reaches parity only in a limited number of scenarios, just in the low scenario. When hydrogen costs are low, fuel cell trucks can become competitive, particularly in Europe and to a lesser extent in Asia. But as hydrogen prices increase, the economics quickly deteriorate. Many of the scenarios no longer achieve parity within the vehicle lifetime. This highlights the primary challenge facing hydrogen trucking today. The technology may itself be suitable for long-haul applications, but the cost of hydrogen remains a significant barrier. And when we compare this to the results of the battery electric pathways we've just seen, battery electric trucks just reach parity just generally sooner and across a much broader range of conditions. And the final variable that we examined was vehicle utilization. So for this analysis, we adjusted the annual distance traveled by each truck by plus or minus 20% relative to our base case. And this lets us see how much that affects tipping points. For simplicity, we're only showing the US results here for the low electricity price and high diesel price scenario, but the same trend appears across all regions and all scenarios. So utilization can have a significant impact on competitiveness. As trucks travel more miles, they accumulate fuel savings more quickly, allowing them to recover higher upfront costs sooner. For example, a fast charging or plug-in charging battery electric truck, the tipping point falls from nearly 14 years in the low utilization case to just over 8 years in the high utilization case, so roughly 5 to 6 year difference. Hydrogen, again, remains uncompetitive. So the broader takeaway of this is that we expect electrification to occur first in fleets operating across predictable high mileage routes. All right, now that we've seen the results and how variables affect tipping points, we go into an outlook. Here, I'll also present some quotes from industry interviews that we conducted to bring in a practical perspective as well. So one thing we heard repeatedly during our interviews was that fleets are balancing both capital and operational risks. So many trucking companies operate relatively small fleets, so a poor vehicle investment or operational disruption can have meaningful impact on their business. So there's considerable caution amongst caution to adoption or against adoption amongst these players. But as we'll see, this uncertainty is also creating opportunities for new business models along with new entrants. So one opportunity emerging from this transition is the rise of integrated freight platforms. So instead of asking fleets to buy trucks and build charging infrastructure themselves, companies are bundling vehicles, charging, energy management, and freight services into a single offering. We're seeing this model emerge in the market. So notable companies here are Watt EV and Nivoya. They build freight operations around electric trucks. Both use software, route optimization, etc., to maximize vehicle utilization and charging efficiency. A recent interesting development was Watt EV ordering more than 300 Tesla semis to work with the Port of Oakland. We expect such models to scale and such startups to be able to potentially disrupt incumbents. Another theme that came up consistently during our interviews was infrastructure readiness. One challenge here is fragmentation. As the quote highlights, fleets often have to work with many different utilities and DSOs or distribution system operators, each with their own processes and timelines. So securing grid capacity can be complex and time-consuming. Many stakeholders also pointed to permitting as a major bottleneck. Electrification projects often require approvals from many authorities like municipalities, environmental authorities, etc., and not just the utility. So this can take months or even years, slowing adoption, regardless of how attractive vehicle economics may be. So these interviews reinforce that infrastructure readiness will be one of the primary determinants to adoption. Despite these challenges, depot charging is the easiest to scale as it requires the least coordination outside the fleet operators. By comparison, battery swapping, catenary systems, wireless charging, etc., all require broader ecosystem investment and standardization. So scaling is more difficult. Swapping is prevalent mostly in China, where CATL especially is quite active. This quote illustrates that battery electric trucks need the right operating conditions to work properly. So this involves typically routes with predictable schedules, high utilization, and reliable access to charging infrastructure. The implication is that adoption is unlikely to occur uniformly across the trucking industry. Instead, we expect electrification to begin in applications such as drayage, port operations, regional freight corridors, where routes are more predictable and vehicles return to the same locations regularly. These applications are also suited to depot charging and can achieve the high utilization needed to support the economics we discussed earlier. In contrast, long-haul operations with variable routes remain more challenging because of charging requirements and infrastructure constraints. That is, you can't always be sure that you have access to a charging system when you need it. And on a broader note, as fleets electrify, they become large electricity consumers and also potentially flexible grid assets. So managed charging can shift demand away from peaks, reduce charging costs, and in some markets even provide additional revenues through demand response or flexibility programs. But this will also require some additional investment because fleets may need larger batteries, additional charging infrastructure, or more energy management systems. So fleet operators will need to evaluate whether this additional revenue justifies any additional capital investment. So let me close with 3 key takeaways. First, electrification will scale where operations are most predictable. So applications like drayage and regional freight corridors are likely to lead adoption because they combine fixed routes, high utilization, and access to depot charging. Second, infrastructure remains the primary constraint. The economics are increasingly compelling in many scenarios, but charging deployment and grid capacity will determine how quickly adoption occurs. And finally, electrification is creating a new freight energy ecosystem. As fleets become large electricity consumers, we're seeing new business models emerge around charging, energy management, and integrated freight services. And these business models have potential to disrupt the status quo or the incumbents. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, and thank you, Anirudh. We'll now take some questions you might have in the presentation, which you can type into the questions box on your screen. If we don't get to your question on this discussion, we'll make sure to be in touch after the webinar as well. So we talked a lot about economics. There's a question here on subsidies. Pretty directly, how important are subsidies and incentives to adoption of low-emission trucks?
I'd say they're very important because many of these subsidies can significantly reduce the CapEx burden. One example is in California with its HVIP program, which is Clean Truck and Bus Incentive Voucher. There, they provide subsidies of up to $120,000 per truck, or sometimes even more when under specific conditions. So that can significantly accelerate parity. Also, while speaking to some stakeholders here in the Netherlands, we did hear that the subsidies are really a lot in demand. So if the government announces subsidies today, they're typically gone by tomorrow. So the demand is clearly there. So I'd say they're really important and would play a major role in how quickly adoption occurs.
Mm-hmm. And that might be related to the second question here, which is about small and mid-sized fleet operators, right? So beyond some of the big trucking companies, do you think there will be any challenges specifically that they face?
The biggest challenge for them is the risk. So they need the risk to reduce. because as I also briefly hinted upon in the presentation, if they make a mistake, they can likely go bust. So they need to access these subsidies to help scale infrastructure. And we're also seeing companies like WattEV, et cetera, access these subsidies. So for them, it's mostly about risk and how quickly they can, for instance, get access to some charging infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And time for one last question here. Is battery swapping really an option? It seems like a very big infrastructure hurdle and barrier.
Yes, we did see economics being really promising, but the infrastructure is a huge burden. In China, there's a lot of effort, mostly because of policy, but outside of China, it's still really nascent, and we don't expect it to scale, at least in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's primarily because automakers will have to start adapting their truck designs to choose to suit battery swapping systems. There needs to be a considerable investment in battery swapping stations. And also in our conversations with some stakeholders, we heard that there are concerns around security because battery swapping stations typically will house a lot of high value batteries. And that raises some additional security concerns. So based on all of this, we don't really expect battery swapping scaling outside of China in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, understood. Well, thank you very much for your time and insights today, Anirudh. That will conclude our webinar for today. The presentation and recording from the webinar will be sent to all attendees via email later today, so keep an eye out for that. After you leave, you'll be prompted to complete a survey in today's presentation. We always appreciate any feedback you might have. It helps to inform and improve future webinars. So take a moment to check out upcoming webinars on our website, and thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day.